Aitch Alberto, thanks so much for being with us today at Sci-Fi-Vision. We're so excited to talk to you. I was not familiar with your new film, Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, is out in theaters in the US next Friday, September 8th.
Yes.
I was not familiar, it's based on a book. I was not familiar with it. I didn't know the story at all until I watched the movie earlier today. Um,
Okay. Well, I'm happy you got to know these beautiful characters in this story. It's been a 9-year journey, so it's I definitely knew the story, and it's been translated into 60 something languages. So yes, I'm really excited that you were able to discover it.
Thank you. You have said that from the moment you read the book, you wanted to bring this to the screen. What is it that that set that fire in you?
I think it handled themes in a way that we haven't seen before, specifically from the Latino community. I thought the book had a gentleness and a lyricism that we don't often see when it comes to these stories. And I was really impassioned, and it felt really urgent for me to be the person that brings these characters to life, because I think it's necessary for my community to have an option that we haven't seen before. And I think that comes from us who have lived these experiences, can tell these stories authentically, because we're at the helm and writing our own stories, which is also traditionally not something that we've seen, because it was fighting against tropes and showing us these characters differently than the stereotype that we've seen.
I, I agree with you. I thought it's very sensitively handled. It's a coming of age story. These two young men who become best friends, and they're 15, 16 years old, struggling. It's about their sexuality, but also about like young men growing up and the different kinds of pressures they face. I found it kind of universal. I mean, I've never been a young man, but I found it kind of universal in the sense that um, you don't have to come from maybe a Mexican community to have been through the same thing, right? I thought it was really subtle the way that it was handled. That it wasn't like this should appeal to really all audiences, I think.
I think that's the intent, right? I think that the universal aspect of it is that we can all relate to the painful journey of like discovering who we are and accepting that. And I think it's easy to sort of like distill this story and these characters to one aspect of their identity. And I think it's really important to sort of celebrate the nuances of everything we are. And that's truthfully just rooting the story in love. And that's what's becomes universal. And it informs our perspective, but it isn't our whole story. And that's what I'm most passionate about within this story. For me as a storyteller and a director, is to sort of move away from the narrative that's exclusively about one aspect of identity. It's like we're not a monolith, and there's so much more to investigate and explore.
The story's set in El Paso, Texas, uh, with some beautiful scenery, and they're out in the desert. You, I believe, are from Miami, a very different environment to grow up in. But were you able to like find some inspiration from your own history and community? Uh,
Yeah, I think that was one of the
family?
things that I gave myself permission to do and sort of like infuse into the story and in the adaptation, was bring in my own lived experience, which is what makes it sort of universal to Latinos specifically, was that there's so many differences, but also so many similarities. So it was allowing myself to sort of bring that in to the story and to color it, and also realizing that I was working in a different medium. So I needed to bring in my own lived experience in order to authentically tell this story. But I think my intent was always to create a world that was grounded where magic was possible.
It's set in the 80s. I think 1987 is when the story is set. Um, and that makes this a period piece. Although I found I'm pretty old. I'm from the 80s. I found the period touches were very subtle. I thought that maybe that's because everything 80s is cool again, or maybe it's because I think every single thing in the story could happen today. It didn't have to be grounded in the 80s. I'm interested in your decision to go with. I mean, that's what the story was, but go with the period and how you brought that in.
Well, I'm so happy that you recognize that, because I wanted to make something that was timeless, where it didn't feel sort of the stereotype that we see from the 80s, or it didn't feel too kitschy, and to lean into that. That was very intentional, because I think, if you lived in the 80s, it wasn't always like the big hair and the sort of like neon tracksuit. So I wanted to make sure that it was something that multi-generational people could watch and could watch together. And I think that was sort of approaching it with the nuance of what that is, but also making it super 80s by having a soundtrack that reflected that. And I think, sure, that was often like a suggestion we could have like made it now, but there's such an immediacy to the way we communicate that I think would have been lost in the longing of a first love or a first connection that these two boys go through the writing of letters and the sort of waiting anticipation of what that is. We don't have that anymore. So I really wanted to honor that and show that in a way that maybe young stories can't do now.
That's true. There's that period of time where they're separated, and waiting for the letter. I think Ari has 2 letters from Dante he hasn't read. Nowadays, those kids would just be texting and FaceTiming, right? It's like your friend isn't even gone.
And there's something so beautiful about that we've lost. I'm not going to say my age, but I'm of a generation that lived in between, both not having the immediacy of how we communicate now and also having it. So I just think we would have lost so much of that painful longing that you go through as a teenager when you didn't have accessibility like the way we have it now.
Yeah. There's also a small 80s touch where I believe it's Ari's mother is watching the news, and there's a news broadcast. Um, uh, People, there's like an HIV protest going on, right? People, it's not a protest; it's in support, a demonstration in support of uh, people living with HIV. I think is what's on the news. And it's an interesting little like throw in there to like sort of ground us in what was going on in society at that time around. There was a lot of fear about gay people. In the
I wanted to remind audiences in a way that wasn't hitting anybody over the head in the time period that we're in, right? And those protests were in a fight to recognize the value of the life of a gay person in the 80s, which, we have made some steps, but I think we're still going through that conversation, and it's evolved into like different folks now. So it's still something that we need to sort of realize that we're still living, while also recognizing that we've come a really long way, while also not perpetuating a stereotype or the trauma porn that we've so often seen when it comes to stories like this. And that was my decision in not showing the bashing that happens to Dante, because we've just excessively and unnecessarily seen that so many times. And also when it comes to stories about a period that took place during the AIDS crisis. So that was also very intentional of like winking at it and reminding us, but not making the story about that.
Right. And yet you chose to show like the violence that follows that, right? The way that Ari responds in maybe a stereotypically masculine way, of defending his friend.
I think that of defending his friend is exactly right. And I think that moment had to be so intense and so violent, because it was such a journey that we were watching him in, of internalizing so much, that I think he needed that release of sort of not only getting revenge for his friend, but releasing for himself, which allows us to have this really beautiful conversation that we see after that with his parents, which I think is what inspires them to have to step in and use their voices in a way that maybe is uncomfortable for them.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we only have a few seconds left, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you again so much. I think this movie, as I said, I think young men, young women, adults, I think everybody can find something in the story that reflects a bit of themselves. And congratulations on your long odyssey to bring it into the screen. I'm sure it's going to be a big hit.
Thank you for your mindful questions. I really appreciate it, and I agree 100%. There's something universal for everybody, and I hope that everyone goes to the theater to discover that with these characters.
Great. Well, thank you again very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Bye.
Bye.